Hello and welcome to the first Vijñapti podcast episode. I'm Chris, and I'm joined here today by a very special first guest, Nick Bright. Nick is a scholar of East Asian Buddhism, specializing in Japanese Shingon Buddhist art and architecture. He studied at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, where he earned a master's in East Asian languages and cultures in 2022 and a master's in religion in spring of 2024. He aims to get a PhD and become a professor of Japanese religion. Been running an educational podcast with a co-host that releases on all platforms every Friday at 3 p.m. Central for nearly 3 years now, called Bright on Buddhism. In it, he and his co-host discuss topics in Buddhism in a casual and conversational manner. Read and discuss translations of sutras, discuss some of Nick's research, and much, much more. Nick, thanks for being on, and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for the wonderful introduction. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. It's really special that you can be my first guest, and, just with your involvement in Vijñapti and kind of helping me get things going, it's good to have you, and I'm glad that you can be the first guest on the show. So, since I am a little nervous, I wanted to start with kind of a bit of a game. It's just something to kind of break the ice, and one, break the ice, and then I guess two, just kind of show people kind of where you're at in terms of, where you stand on certain philosophical, metaphysical issues, let's say. So, basically, I'll be doing a speed run of 10 questions. You can answer yes, no, or maybe. The only catch for that is the maybe has to be that you're on the fence about it. And if it's maybe something that, you're not sure the meaning of, we can discuss that after, but we'll just do the speed run like that for the sake of brevity. Does that sound okay?
Sounds fun. Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So let's begin in three, two, one. Do you believe in reincarnation?
Yes.
Do you believe in spirits or ghosts?
Yes.
Do you believe in vaccines?
Yes.
Do you believe in God?
No.
Do you believe in evolution?
Yes.
Do you believe in therapy?
Yes.
Do you believe in psychology?
Yes.
Do you believe in an afterlife?
No.
Do you believe in a soul?
No.
Do you believe in enlightenment?
Yes.
Okay, that wraps it up. So, a little weird, but yeah, I think I just figure those questions will be, kind of interesting to discuss in terms of your own, you know, metaphysical worldview, let's say. So, um, yeah, well, those are the short answers. Again, I'm sure there's plenty that you were like, depends what we're talking about here, but we'll get into that, as we discuss more about you. So, Nick, tell me about your journey through spirituality, school, religion, both at a personal and an academic level. Why Buddhism? What drew you towards Buddhism? What drew you towards Eastern religion and philosophy? And yeah, why is it so central to you in, again, personal and then also academic life?
That's a good question. Yeah, thank you for throwing that my way, and thank you for the game. That was fun, and I didn't expect that. I didn't know what you were going to ask, and I it sounds like I had my answers prepared because I answered so quickly, and I didn't answer maybe to any of them, but I had not had those questions beforehand, and I thought that was really fun. So, getting to the
Cool.
topic of what I am up to with religion and stuff, I guess we could start with the fact that I wasn't really raised in a religious household. I'm from the American Southeast. I'm from North Carolina, and you would expect, of course, that in such an environment I would be raised Christian. But luckily, at least I believe luckily, I wasn't raised particularly specific into any tradition. I wasn't raised into Christianity or into Buddhism or into anything else. And I think that that gave
Okay.
me a lot of freedom and a lot of, I guess you could say, opportunity with regards to how I could explore and how I could really figure out what worked for me and what didn't over the course of my adolescence and then my adulthood as well. So I went into high school and college without having had any sort of tradition imposed upon me. I had been exposed through my parents and grandparents to some new age self help guru type thinkers, such as Wayne Dyer and Alan Watts and Eckhart Tolle and Ram Dass and many others. And so I broadly
Sure.
knew that Buddhism existed, and I broadly knew that spirituality was something that people do instead of Christianity in most cases, but I didn't really know that much else about it. And so I come into college and I originally wanted to be a medical doctor. I wanted to study biology and I wanted to be like Dr. House on TV. I wanted to study infectious diseases and treat infectious diseases, and I wanted to figure out the mystery of diagnosing a mystery illness and solve the puzzle as it is. And I really was excited about that until I got to, about halfway through my experience where I started to have some misgivings with STEM as an academic pursuit, which we'll probably get to later. And
Sure.
all the while, I had been training in Japanese martial arts. In my freshman year of college, I started training in a martial art called Aikido. And as I mentioned on the episode that we did together previously, the martial part, the hitting, punching, kicking, throwing, all of that is only about 20% of what they do. The other 80% is all meditative or ritualistic stuff. And I just had the simple question of why. Why is it that all of this is going on in this martial art training? I thought I was coming here to learn how to do X, Y, or Z martial art. I didn't know that I was coming to do all of this ritual stuff. And so I just started asking that question and, pushing a little bit deeper to see what I found. And I discovered through that even though no specific Aikido martial artist had ever gone to a specific Japanese Buddhist temple or Buddhist monk and sort of was educated by them, I discovered that just like Christianity influences American culture and worldview, so too does Buddhism have a strong influence on Japanese worldview and Japanese culture and Japanese martial arts practice. And from there, the whole world of East Asian studies as an academic field, but also Buddhism specifically, was opened up to me because I was having experiences through meditation and through these rituals I was doing, which were sort of giving me an experiential education in what Buddhism was about while I was able to pursue an academic education in what it was doing. So from there, I decided to finish my biology degree, but not really do anything with it, and pursue East Asian studies and Japanese Buddhism studies as a career. And so from my undergraduate, which was Furman University, by the way, I went to the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign for my master's degree in East Asian languages and cultures. And there I studied Japanese language to get better at Japanese so I could read the sources. And I also took various classes on just myriad schools of Buddhism in Asia. My specific idea going into it was to look at sacred spaces, but I just wanted to be free and open-minded with regards to what I specified my study into. So I took classes that involved Pure Land, I took classes that involved Zen, I took classes that involved Yogacara, I took classes that involved Shingon and esoteric Buddhism, all of the above. I just sort of took it all in to see what I liked. And my research went a variety of different directions while I was there. I started during the COVID-19 pandemic, so for the first year of my master's, it was completely all online the whole time. And so my first research topic, given that my Japanese wasn't that good, was about Japanese Buddhist responses to COVID-19. What were they saying about it? What were they doing about it? And how were rituals changed and affected by it? The answer was that everything went online. And that was sort of complicated because a lot of very rural temples don't have the internet infrastructure to handle that. So there were some workarounds that turned out to be very interesting for that project. And then later, as my Japanese got better and I started to study classical Japanese as well, I started to branch out into sacred spaces in Shingon Buddhism. And I started to branch out into Edo period Pure Land themed poetry and things like that. And so I finished my degree there in 2022, and I started a degree in religion there to round out my method with regards to the study of religion, so I could actually be more specific than just East Asian studies about what I was doing. And I could really specify how to understand and pursue the study of religion itself, specifically within the scope of East Asian studies. And I just continued my trend of taking it all in while I was doing that. And that brings us up to here. So I have finished that master's degree. So I've got my 2 master's degrees, and now I'm living on the West Coast in Seattle. And I hope to start a PhD sometime soon, where I will get to continue my study of sacred spaces in Japanese Shingon Buddhism. And I've also become an affiliate or a member of the local Shingon Buddhist temple here, which we'll no doubt talk about, but I always love to say I have an amazing time when I go there, and I love the people there. I've had the opportunity to practice my Japanese and to learn about Shingon Buddhism as it is done, not as it was done in history, and not as the texts would have it say it is done, but how actual people do it, which I think is a very important dimension to my education in Shingon Buddhism and also my personal engagement with it. And so that sort of rounds out my whole story with regards to religion, spirituality, and the personal and academic side of things. To answer your question, why Buddhism? That is an interesting one. That's a hard one. This whole time I've been giving this speech, I've been trying to come up with an answer for that, but I don't think that I have a specific one to give you other than I found it to be way more experiential and transformative for my own daily life than any other religion that I had studied or looked at. I had been into Christian churches and I didn't really feel much. I had been in communities where Jewish people were debating the Torah and I didn't really feel much. I had not had a Muslim experience, an Islam experience at that point because it was North Carolina and that's just not really a huge community there. But I had experienced and studied a couple of other religious traditions and they just weren't really doing it for me. But then Buddhism shows up, and the meditation experience specifically had just a huge effect on my day-to-day life, how I felt and how I thought. It slowed down my thinking. It made my body feel better. It made me feel like I could move better. It made me feel like I could use my mind more freely when it comes to thinking about stuff and encountering just what happens in your daily life, encountering whatever stuff comes up, whatever random crazy events happen. I just felt like I could deal with that stuff much easier whenever I was sort of operating from a baseline of Buddhist meditation rather than operating from a baseline of Christian prayer or reading the Torah or anything else like that. So that's sort of how I chose Buddhism. Was it made more of a difference in my day-to-day life than anything else that I was up to or that I had experienced prior to.
Yeah, thanks for all that. Giving your story of kind of everything that led up till now personally and academically, and then also why you chose Buddhism. You mentioned a few things there that I think are really interesting for kind of what I envision, I'm doing with Vijñapti, which is, one of the themes was kind of early on, you mentioned that you were very interested in STEM, and now you're, a scholar of Buddhism. And it's cool that you have those 2 interests and that they're, both important to you. That's kind of the whole gamut of what I'm interested in with Vijñapti is, one, pairing spirituality, religion on the one hand, and then also pairing empirical research and, modern science on the other, but then also being able to challenge both, to be able to explore both critically is very important, and I can see that's important to you as well. The other thing that you had mentioned in so many words, at least, was this idea of perhaps theory on the one hand and praxis in the other, in terms of your interests in religion and spirituality with Aikido. You know, you have this, let's say, theoretical background with everything that you studied in school, with your master's degree, a lot of hardcore academic reading, and then reading the sutras, of course. And then you also have the experiential component of, what that looks like through the body in terms of martial arts. You know, what that looks like in community ritual at the Shingon Temple in Seattle. And, what that looks like in terms of meditation personally. Um, so I think those are very important as well, because what I'm trying to do with Vijñapti is provide people not only with theoretical resources. That's extremely important, I think, and I value that a lot. I value, your scholarship a lot, but I think it's also important to give people tools that they can use. Most people aren't going to be scholars of, religion or scientists. Most people are going to be going about their everyday lives, and even if you are a scholar or a scientist, you still want to have that experiential domain, because I think that's something that's easily lost in the myriad of, whatever capitalism is trying to sell you these days. And even if it wasn't capitalism, um, just the consumerist global culture that we have is undeniable, and it can be easy to forget that, yeah, we are conscious living beings who um, live through experience. And it's cool to see what that looks like for you in terms of, your own personal life. So thanks for all that.
Of
Um,
course.
yeah, yeah. Going back to the questions for a little bit, um, I'll turn it back to you, and then maybe um, this can kind of get at one. If there's anything that you wanted to talk about in terms of the questions, maybe clarifying a bit, further than yes or no on some of those positions, but then also maybe what that looks like for you in terms of how you understand Buddhism and how you practice Buddhism personally and in community.
Wonderful. Yeah. So did you have a question that you wanted to push back to?
Yeah, just I'll leave it kind of open-ended, but if there's anything, let's say, I guess, okay, let's start here. I noticed when I mentioned vaccines, you gave kind of a funny look about if you believed in vaccines, and I guess kind of where I was going with that question was, you're someone who is obviously very involved in religion and studying religion. I was talking about this with my girlfriend yesterday. In countries like Taiwan, let's say, or Japan, it's really not disputed, whether or not you should get the COVID-19 vaccine among people who are also, extremely religious. In the United States, it's a different story. So just considering our audience, if you'd want to clarify anything there in terms of your relationship with science, let's say, on the one hand, and your relationship with religion on the other, where you stand kind of in the middle.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm glad that you called back to it because I was curious about it and about how it ended up on the list. So thanks for that clarification. The answer that I would have for that would be first, absolutely yes. I believe in vaccines, not only the COVID-19 vaccine, but measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, all of these different vaccines that we are all supposed to get when we're school age children, when we're about to go to school and we're kids and we're trying to protect the population around us from all of these illnesses. This includes polio, this includes tuberculosis. I mean, there's all kinds of different vaccines that are available to the population. HPV is another one. And these are all critically important to the preservation of the health and safety of the rest of the community around you and to old people and young people whose immune systems may be compromised, or sick people who may compromised immune systems, and they may face serious illness if they contract the disease in question. So for me, personally, vaccines are not a controversial issue. They, for me, are settled science. It is proven over the last 200 years that inoculating yourself with a small amount of an illness activates your immune system so that whenever you're infected with the real dose, if you are infected with the real dose, then you're better off, because the immune system creates memory cells for that illness. It creates antibodies that your body hangs on to, and so it knows what to do whenever that disease comes back. And vaccines are an especially smart and effective way to cause that immune system response because, of course, the virus or the disease in the vaccine is deactivated. So the disease itself can't infect you. It can't hurt you. So in the United States, the issue of vaccines has been highly politicized, and it's been highly connected to the issue of autism. Now, it's been politicized, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, for really just the reason of building on this autism debate. And so I'd like to start with the autism debate, and then I'll move on to, of course, the religion and science question that you asked at the end of that. So in the 1990s or thereabouts, there was a movement that essentially came about in the US saying that vaccines caused autism in young children. Now, this has been proven completely false. Just completely false. There's no scientific evidence out there that is reputable and that is widely accepted by the scientific community that demonstrates any sort of correlative relationship between vaccines and autism. So it's important to note that at that time, maybe one study came out, but the guy that created it falsified the evidence and was disbarred or had his medical license revoked. So he's no longer allowed to practice medicine. So obviously the science was bad. And this whole movement, it was more, I believe, founded upon just being phobic and being discriminative towards autistic people rather than being afraid of vaccines. I think the issue was a lot more hateful and toxic towards people who did actually have autism, because those people are born that way. They're not going to get it from a vaccine, and they can't change that. They can't change how they are. And the parents, unfortunately, can't change that either. And so I think that there was this strong desire to look for something to blame, something that wasn't the parents' fault to blame, right? It wasn't my fault that my child has autism. It's the vaccines, because they couldn't sleep at night thinking that it was their fault. The truth is, autism is nobody's fault. It's just something that happens. And it's okay that it happens. And it's okay to be autistic. And also, vaccines have nothing to do with it. So I think that that's kind of the primary impetus of that big movement, especially in the United States. And it eventually spread to the entire Western world. And there's also just an anti-intellectualist movement going on too, which is extremely problematic. But what it builds up to is the politicization of that sort of thing during the COVID-19 pandemic, where essentially the cult of personality around Donald Trump will listen to anything he says, do anything he says, even if it's completely false, even if it's evil, even if it's against the interests of all Americans at any point. They will follow it to the letter because, you know, he is their messiah figure. It's really problematic, and it's really horrible to live through in the United States. And I hope that we can cut that cancer out of our society eventually. But the whole politicization of it with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic was not centered on autism, but it was more centered on how fast the vaccine was rolled out, and also the fact that COVID-19 was a novel illness to the human population. And I think that because the trust had been broken between the common people of the United States and the intelligentsia, the scientists, the academics that were coming up with these things, due to this anti-vaxxer movement in the 90s, and also due to repeated funding cuts for education, there was just a perfect storm of like, okay, my Messiah is saying that this is bad. And also, I'm not educated enough to know that it works or it doesn't work. And also, my trust is broken because a lot of people in the 90s were against this. And so, between all of those things, it just completely fell off the wayside. And there were those that always believed in vaccines the whole way through, or there were those that didn't believe in them. And there wasn't really a lot of population in between. I've always been on the believe in them population, and I've always been lucky enough to be educated enough to know how it works, why it works, and specifically that it works, to know that it works. And that has never been a religious question for me. That's never been an academic question for me. It's always been very specifically a scientific question. And this is getting close to the question about science and religion you were
Sure.
asking before.
And sorry,
I compartmentalize those
yeah,
things.
sorry, just to since we're on the topic, I'll throw in the evolution question there as well, since I think that kind of fits into
Oh,
um
absolutely.
yeah, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I compartmentalize about stuff. I I think that science and religion give us tools for dealing with our daily lives. And we have specific needs that come up that need a specific tool to address. Science is really good, it's proven to be really good at addressing having a broken leg, having COVID 19, protecting the public from public health disasters, and remedying whatever sort of medical needs that one might have. Religion is really good at providing tools to answer for more abstract needs for community, needs for a feeling of belonging, needs for feeling like you're connected to something larger than yourself, needs for feeling like you have a position in the universe and you have a destination in the universe. You have an origin point, a position now, and an ending point, wherever that may be. And those needs and thus the tools that are answering for them are completely separate for me. And no narratives that science comes up with or that religion comes up with intersect for me because the needs they address are different. Now, there is this whole science versus religion debate. Does religion have a place in a scientific world? Does science have a place in a religious world? I think that the answer across the board is yes, because there's no science versus religion. There is the stuff that science does and the stuff that religion does. And those two don't need to meet or intersect or counteract each other or obstruct each other. Unless, of course, the religion is something like don't get vaccinated, don't, wash your hands, don't wash your clothes, all that stuff. That's not really productive. That's obstructive to the community need of religion because it's going to make everyone around you sick, right? That's sort of not a utilitarian doctrine to have or to hold. So my point with all that is that the narratives that science comes up with ought not to be political. They ought not to be existential or spiritual. They ought to be just evidence-based, just the facts, right? And these facts have a specific method by which they're verified. Religion doesn't really deal in falsifiable facts. And some people may look upon that as a weakness of the entire thing, the entire edifice within which exists Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, all of the religions of the world. I don't think of that as a weakness because the questions that it asks cannot be verified, cannot be falsified, cannot be experimentally addressed by the tools which science uses. And that's just okay. That's just simply okay. I can believe in evolution and vaccines and reincarnation and enlightenment all at the same time because none of those get really in the way of each other. And I think that speaks to why vaccines are widely accepted in Taiwan and China and Japan, is because even if there are people who are devoutly religious there, they are, one, very educated, more educated than the United States. Two, they didn't have this anti-vaxxer thing going on in the 90s that we had. And three, they understand that the narratives that Buddhism is giving to them don't outweigh or occlude science. They don't interfere or get in the way of just the facts, if that makes sense. And this is speaking broadly. Of course, there are anti-vaxxers in China, Taiwan, and Japan and Korea, and there are people who are devoutly religious and reject science. While on the other hand, there's also people who ascribe to scientism in East Asia. But I think that having a strong education system really helps prevent problems like that and prevents anti-vaxxerism, prevents anti-intellectualism, and things like that. So I reconcile all these because they don't interfere for me. Buddhism doesn't really counteract evolution. It doesn't really interact with the theory of evolution for me in any way. It has a particular diagnosis of the state of reality, but it doesn't have a diagnosis for how physiology changes among a species over biological time. It just simply doesn't. Nothing in Buddhism claims to do any of that. And to try and believe or try and argue that something in science or in Buddhism
Sure.
is subsumed by
Wow,
the
thank you
other
for all that. I
gets
didn't
really
expect that
problematic
to be
really
such a
fast.
lengthy answer, which, was a good one. And it highlights just how complex this stuff is. It's not just as simple as, go get vaccinated. It's not just, well, I think in this question that you were talking about of religion versus science, it's easy to get lost in the opposite of what I was saying, um, which is that, you know, we can't say anything because it's all relative, right? It's just depends on how you look at it. It just depends on your perspective. And so we really can't know, or we really can't say, postmodernism, post-structuralism, all that. Um, but it's not really useful when we're trying to figure out like what to actually do. Um, and more than that, intellectually, it kind of suggests that we can't really say anything. Um, we can't say that, this is a fact or this is not a fact. When in reality, yeah, there are things that we can say with pretty good certainty. Go get vaccinated is one of them in my view. The theory of evolution holds up against, repeated analysis and scientific research, and it's important to keep that in mind because we can get pulled back and forth in different directions when we're kind of in the middle of this science on the one hand and religion spirituality on the other, with clarity, with certainty. And yeah, I think that, there are different reasons why people might be skeptical one way or the other. I think you mentioned education and vaccines, and, while that's certainly an important part of the story, there are many reasons why someone might be skeptical about, vaccines. For example, with the Black community, there's been a lot of being taken advantage of historically by medical research with the Tuskegee Project, and how Black servicemen were taken advantage of historically. And that's not to say that you were saying anything about that, but it's hard. And that's kind of what I meant more with the complexity, is that while there are things that we can say with certainty, while there are things that are verifiably true that we can say, yeah, this is more or less a fact, and we can wager our gamble on this, and you know probably come out the other side well and fine. There's plenty of reasons why someone might justifiably be skeptical about science, medicine, and that's important because when it comes to the nature of consciousness, um, even in this first episode, we've gotten into some pretty political discussions, and I just think it's inevitable. I think it's something that, we can't talk about what the nature of our mind is without talking about what is to be done at the level of our political systems, at the level of how we govern, at the level of how we live in a society. It's just not possible because our the nature of our minds is inherently shaping and shaped by all of those factors. My point there was it's complex, but there are things that we can say with certainty about the one science, but also about the nature of our mind thereof. So,
I was just going to say
yeah,
that it's important to remember that in the community of science, academically speaking, you know, no one who is a scientist worth their salt is going to say, yes, science has all the answers. Science has it completely figured out. And I think that it's important to take that perspective towards one's own religion as well. That's what I try to do. And I think that knowing that both camps are trying their best to answer the question and that the answers to the questions change over time given new information, given new sort of ways of thinking, given new experiences, given new needs expressed by society at large and the communities within those camps. I think that understanding that helps you see, like, yeah, it is sort of both complicated and straightforward because you can acknowledge your own positionality. For example, I'm not a person of color who has been taken advantage of by the government, and so I say these things without a second thought. But I completely understand why people who have been taken advantage of and who have been lied to and who have been really harmed in a generational way would have second thoughts. And understanding that positionality and the positionality of everyone around you and understanding sort of everybody's doing their best with what they have really helps sort of place this puzzle together, if that makes sense. That's sort of what my takeaway was from the fact that you can indeed take something complex in theory, but still be able to say something clear and concise in reality. And also understanding too that the only core thing that we can really hope for is to just do what's best for us and those around us in any sort of moment. And I don't think that either science or religion will cover or capture all of that in every context, right? And so,
yeah,
yeah, that's kind of, I appreciate that part about the understanding one's own consciousness and one's own mind in relationship to communities, in relationship to other minds, if we can even say that others exist.
sure. Yeah, yeah, maybe I forget the term. I feel dumb now. But that idealism, I think it's called, only my mind exists,
Or
and
solipsism.
solipsism. Yep. Um, yeah, that's what I was going for. It's been a minute for me. I need to get back into the whole uh, philosophy thing. But yeah, let's. So thank you for all that, and I think you mentioned something in that last part there of well, yeah, I'll come back to that. Kind of had a brain fart. It's my first episode, so don't judge me too hard, Nick. But
Yeah, no problem. You were going to ask me something else before I started on that whole tangent, right?
yeah. So I was going to. I think that leads well into. That's what I was going to say. I think this leads well into kind of your conception of Buddhist cosmology, um, but more than that, focusing kind of towards Vijñapti stuff. What does your conception of the ontological nature of mind look like in light of Buddhism, in light of, science? And I think that a good way to get at that would to be to talk about some of those questions that we had before. So you mentioned that you believe in reincarnation, in spirits, um, but not God or an afterlife. And I think you said that you believe in enlightenment, but not a soul. So, what does that look like for, again, you in terms of
Absolutely. Yeah,
Buddhism,
thank you for
but then
that.
also how you think
I
about
think
what is
that
this thing that we're calling
to get at that
consciousness? What is
answer,
this
I want to
thing
first
that
say
we're
that
calling consciousness that is also
I
allowing me to talk
don't
to
think of
you and you
myself
to talk
as
to
a
me and us
Buddhist.
to express these
Depending on my
things that we're
mood,
calling
maybe if I'm in a
ideas?
different mood
What
later,
is
I'll
what
say
does
that
that
I
look
am a
like for you?
Buddhist. But most of the time, when you ask me, just the general anybody asks me, are you a Buddhist? Most of the time, I'll say no. Even though I go to the temple every week, even though I bow and chant in front of statues to the Buddha, and even though I have Buddha statues all over my house and all this other stuff, I'll still say no. And my fiance gets very annoyed with the fact that I do that. By the way, she's like, "Of course you're a Buddhist. You're a more devout Buddhist than any family members I've ever had are devout Christians. Like it's serious. You're really into Buddhism all the time. Stop lying to yourself and everybody else." But I don't think I'm a Buddhist. Nonetheless, one doctrine in particular has just sort of infected me to my core. And that doctrine in particular is impermanence and everything that follows through that, everything that comes through that, everything that shakes out from impermanence. So the Buddhist conception of impermanence obviously is that all things undergo change all the time. Everything that exists only exists provisionally, and it's provisionally on causes and conditions that allow that thing to exist. And that thing existing, of course, is also a cause and a condition for something else to exist. Because everything is always changing all the time at every scale, then the question is, okay, well, is anything actually populated by something that we could call a soul? Is anything everlasting and unchanging? And to answer the question of, do I believe in a soul? No, I don't, because I believe in impermanence just all the way down to the very substrata of reality. And impermanence completely knocks the conception of a soul out the window. So because I don't believe in a soul, then of course I don't believe in an afterlife. However, I was interested by the choice of asking, do you believe in reincarnation and do you believe in an afterlife coming together? That's a very interesting combination, and I'm glad that you asked it that way, because some would regard reincarnation as being an afterlife, as being somewhere that you go after you die. Even a lot of Buddhists would believe that, because, the truth is, just like with Christianity and other religions in the West, most people who would self-identify as Buddhists, they don't know everything about the religion. They haven't read everything. Very few Christian people I have ever met have ever read the Bible cover to cover. And similarly, you could expect that very few Buddhists have ever read any of the sutras or all of the sutras. It's just not realistic to expect. So that being the case, I don't think of reincarnation. I don't think of what happens after we die as being an afterlife. I don't think that you go somewhere else necessarily. Now, I might get a little scientific in saying this right here, but it's pretty settled that the Earth that we live on is a closed system. Very little gets added in and very little gets subtracted out. So very little comes to us from outside the atmosphere, and we don't send very much out the atmosphere ourselves. So overall, the atoms that we are working with, the molecules we're working with here on the Earth, on this little sliver that we have on the surface in between the fiery core and the vacuum of space, everything that exists on that sliver is all we have. It's all we have to work with. So it all gets recycled. You're drinking the same water, perhaps, that Alexander the Great drank, and you're breathing the same air that perhaps Genghis Khan breathed, and you're breathing, you're eating the same atoms in your food that perhaps once made up an entire person, or made up a mountain, or made up a tree, or made up something else, right? So this is all we have. And so it's impossible to say that when you die, anything goes anywhere. You just disaggregate, you dissolve. All the atoms, all the molecules that make you up, they don't leave. They don't stop being where they are. They just go back into the earth. They go back into the air if you're cremated. They go back into the stomachs of vultures if you have a sky funeral, right? There's only so many things that can happen. And this speaks to something very important about impermanence. Even though everything is changing all the time and there is nothing out there that is unchanging, there is still relative continuity. It's not all just random chaos all the time. So what you do in your life will likely lead into the next thing.
And sorry, if you don't mind, just because this is the first show, if maybe you could just talk a little bit about some of those Buddhist terms that you're using, like impermanence, for example,
Yeah,
or
absolutely.
just to someone who's maybe not
impermanence
super
is this
familiar
doctrine,
with those terms.
like I mentioned before, it's the universal changing of everything all the time. So there's nothing that stays permanently the same. There's nothing that's unchanging. There's no soul. There's no substrate to reality that doesn't get affected. Everything is always undergoing change. And this sort of is important for what we are going through in our daily lives. Our default state is to desire for something permanent, is to desire for something unchanging. We want unchanging pleasure and unchanging absence of pain. And impermanence says, unfortunately, that's not possible. And I think that all of our lives can sort of confirm that. All of our experiences can confirm that. We want to be happy and euphoric forever, but sometimes sad stuff happens. And we want to be free from pain, but sometimes we get hurt. That's just simply the nature of reality. That's the nature of how the world works around us. And so this impermanence exists at every single scale, right? The entire universe is undergoing change, all the way down to, the atoms in your body are undergoing change. And so all of that speaks to the fact that there is no such thing as soul that goes anywhere when we die. But because of this idea of relative continuity that I was talking about earlier, because of the absence of complete chaos in our lives, there's momentum. And this momentum obviously will stop me from turning into dust in the next second, or it'll stop me from turning into a door, or it'll stop me from dying and then turning into something else, like an entire mountain, right at the moment of my death. That kind of stuff doesn't happen. We know that doesn't happen. And because, like I said, it's a closed system, our atoms go into the earth, and the earth nourishes the plants, and the plants feed the animals, and the plants and the animals feed the humans. It's all the same. It's all in the same closed system. And so that's kind of why I believe in reincarnation, is because it speaks to the fact that there are parts of you that will go on and be parts of something else. That's just simple fact for me. And it also speaks to the fact that the momentum in your life leads to something that is relative to what you're headed towards now in the future. If you're headed towards bad now, bad will come in the future. If you're headed towards good now, good will come in the future. And this headed towards thing I'm saying is regarding your behaviors, your thoughts, your feelings, the things you're pursuing. Now, of course, we desire all good and no bad, but we can't have that all the time. But generally speaking, the things that we head for that are good turn out good, and the things we head for that are bad turn out bad. And the way we judge good or bad, of course, is it something that is not indulgent, but rather constructive for your character or for that of people around you? Is it something that's not harmful to you or those around you? Is it something that makes you a better person, a more well-rounded person, a smarter person, a more compassionate person, a kinder person? These are the kinds of questions that you can ask to judge these things. And so that's also kind of why I believe in ghosts too, and spirits. I think that just like there's this material aspect of dying and dissolving and being part of the physical cycle of the world around us, there's also an ineffable consciousness aspect, an ineffable consciousness cycle that is undergoing as well. And this all builds up into the Buddhist doctrine of the five skandhas, or the five aggregates. I personally believe in that very closely, and that just simply is reiterating what I've just said. It says that in the world, there are five things, types of things that cling together, and when they do, that's what a person is. That's what consciousness is. That's how we understand ourselves. And those five things that clump together are form, the material aspect I was talking about. And when they come together, they give rise to sensation, feelings that are received from sensory organs like sight, sound, touch. And sensations lead to perception. This is a good or a bad sensation, right? A perception is thinking that what you're sensing is either pleasurable or painful. And deciding that something is good or bad determines mental activity, which is the fourth aggregate, which is I'm going to avoid something bad or pursue something good. And consciousness is the fifth aggregate, and it comes out of the mental activities because you're aware that you're doing this. Consciousness is the awareness that this mental activity is happening. You can think of it almost as meta awareness because you're aware while you're pursuing something good and avoiding something bad, but you're also aware that you're aware. So it's meta consciousness. And this consciousness is like understanding, I have this addiction to something bad, and I keep pursuing the bad thing that I'm addicted to. I'm aware that I'm addicted, but my addiction is still an illness that I'm struggling with. That's the awareness. That's the consciousness. It's the ability to change that mental activity. And so I really believe in that hardcore. I really believe that that's how the world works, and that when a person dies, all that stuff disaggregates, dissolves. And if the material aspect does, then so too must the consciousness, and then reaggregate into something else.
Yeah, thanks for that. That really, one, starting to get into, this thing that we might call Buddhist psychology on the one hand, but then also at the same time, you're giving this is kind of what I think this thing that we're calling consciousness is. And it, again, gets into a lot of, philosophical issues in terms of what is the nature not only of our minds, but by extension, what is the nature of reality itself? Because our minds are inherently, this atomic ordering the structure of our brains, of our physical bodies that give rise to sensation, that give rise to conscious awareness. And it's really cool to see, and I can see that you truly feel this and truly believe it. It's not like you're just kind of doing some like mental gymnastics to make them amenable to each other, but it's really cool to see that your worldview of what the mind is, of what reincarnation is very strongly predicated upon, these scientific facts that we have of, yeah, the earth is a closed system. Everything kind of gets recycled in terms of, the atoms of water that we drink and that sustain our bodies, or the air that we breathe. Those are kind of just scientific facts that, they are just scientific facts, but the way that you understand them and perceive them really plays into your religious, spiritual worldview. And I just think that's so cool because it's, again, you're not making a hard and fast distinction between the two. They both exist. And I think that's a really cool synthesis in terms of, how you see the world. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. I wanted to get into kind of, again, since we're talking more about, we were kind of getting more into Buddhist psychology with, just the discussion of the five aggregates. I was curious to know, from your point of view, what does Buddhism have to offer to the investigation of consciousness in the 21st century? And since you are very interested in this guy that I'm very interested in, who's named Kukai, and his school of Shingon Buddhism, I'm curious to know what you think Buddhism has to offer to investigating consciousness, in the modern 21st century, kind of from Buddhism, the point of view of Buddhism in general, but then also more specifically what you're interested in, which is Shingon Buddhism, Kukai.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for that question. So,
and yeah,
if you had asked me
go from there.
that maybe, say, 6 months ago or earlier, then it's very likely that I simply wouldn't have had an answer. And the reason why is because up to that point, my education in Buddhism had really been mostly, if not all, theoretical. Of course, I had had meditation experiences in martial arts, and they definitely helped me feel good in the moment and stuff. But it's an open question whether I was actually doing specifically Buddhist meditation. Now, from having had classes in grad school, I understand that what is Buddhist meditation is an open question itself. But I had thought to myself, oh, this is Aikido stuff. This isn't Buddhist stuff. It may be influenced by Buddhism, but it's not itself necessarily Buddhism. So I got this whole entire theoretical and academic education and understanding of Buddhism prior. in my grad school years. And I thought to myself, like, yeah, there is a specific diagnosis of mind, and there's all these doctrines about what we ought to do and what we ought not to do and why. And there's doctrines about the nature of reality and about everyone in it and how the world works, how the world turns, all that good stuff. But there was just a disconnect there at the time. And the disconnect was that I had not really experienced or encountered a lot of Buddhism actually being practiced. I wasn't around a Buddhist community. I was just learning about mostly dead ones in school. And so I didn't have this idea of what Buddhism actually does for people, with people, on a day-to-day basis. So, of course, back then I wouldn't have had an answer about how does Buddhism help people understand themselves, help people solve their problems, help people deal with daily life. I would have said meditation is generally a good thing, and I think a lot of people should do it. I think that being mindful of your actions and their consequences and their effects on other people is a good way to live. But I wouldn't have said something really specific about Buddhism in that sense. Now, having been to this Shingon temple for 6 months, my answer would completely change. And the reason why is because I am living Buddhism in a way that I did not do before. I would learn about it all day, and it would shape the way I thought and shape the way that I perceived myself and the world around me, but not really in an immediately present sense. But now that I'm actually going to this temple, I can see what function it's serving for me and for living people around me on a day-to-day basis. And so what that is doing, what it is serving, is to validate everybody's experiences and to validate everyone exactly as they are, and to encourage them not only to understand that they are precious, that they are deserving of loving kindness and compassion, but then to also understand that so is everybody else. So this is going to get into Kukai now. For those that don't know, Kukai is the founder of Japanese Shingon Buddhism. He lived in Japan in this period between 774, I think, and 835 AD. The ones place on those years might be wrong, but generally those decades are right. And this was a very important and transformative period for Buddhism in Japan. But essentially, Kukai went and got educated in China with regards to what is up with Buddhism. The Emperor of Japan, who had sponsored him actually first as a Tendai monk, sent him off to figure out what's up. And whenever he went there, he had an encounter with esoteric Buddhism. And I could give you all kinds of details, but I'll spare you. I won't take up too much of your time. And he came back and he founded Shingon. And Shingon translates into English as mantra. The character Shin means true, and the character Gon means word or speech. And so mantra is true speech. And that's what sort of separates it from other practices of Buddhism up to that time period. Not after, but up to that time period. It centers around prayers, the chanting of mantra, the chanting of specific phrases and words, because those specific words and the sounds they make have power. And so this is the kind of Buddhism that we're dealing with, that I'm encountering whenever I go to the temple every week. This type of Buddhism is a very even mix, in my opinion, between what we would call Vajrayana, the more Tibetan style of esoteric Buddhism, and Mahayana, East Asian Buddhism, which emphasizes the practice of the Bodhisattva path. So we have this esoteric stuff, and we also have this very practical Mahayana Bodhisattva path stuff. The esoteric stuff isn't really relevant here. I could get into it, and we could talk about it for years and probably not get anywhere. But the practical stuff is simply, you must be the most compassionate, the most selfless, the most loving and kind, the most good that you can be to everyone all the time. And in Buddhism specifically, in the cosmological sense, the responsibility of the Bodhisattva is to help all beings on Earth, in all of this reality, reach enlightenment. In esoteric Buddhism, it's even more urgent than that. You have to do it in this lifetime. And so that's sort of their task. That's sort of what they're up to. And so the mechanism by which this works is one of the implications of impermanence, this doctrine I talked about earlier. The mechanism is through emptiness. If there is no soul, if there is no substrate of reality that is unchanging, then it is marked by this characteristic that the Buddhists call empty. In Sanskrit, this is shunyata. It's the absence of there being a permanent, substantial, unchanging thing in anything. It's really funny. My temple's head monk doesn't say emptiness. He doesn't like that translation. He says everythingness. He says everythingness. And the reason why is because everything that arises in reality being empty is, as a result, dependent on everything else in reality in order to arise. And its interdependence on everything else means that it shares the same nature with everything else. That is to say that, a soul cannot cause the absence of a soul to arise, right? Things have to be of the same nature in order to dependently co-arise in this reality. And if everything shares the same nature, that's how prayer works. Whenever I say a mantra, I'm not saying a mantra just for me. I'm saying a mantra that applies to and that covers all sentient beings, past, present, and future, under its purview. Because they are all the same nature as me. I am a complete and total orchestration of the universe, and so is everybody else. And so is everything else. And so whenever I do something, whenever I say something, whenever I practice something, it has ripples, it has effects, it has a positive result for everybody, not just me. And so in Shingon Buddhism, the double aspect of that is that what you do saves the world. It is very important. It is very critical, and it's very impactful. And so it must be good. It must be kind, compassionate. It must be wise. It must be knowledgeable of emptiness and suffering and all of that. But also, the other aspect is that you yourself also have this Buddha nature, this Bodhisattva nature. Buddha nature is a doctrine in Mahayana Buddhism that relates to the fact that all of reality, everyone in it, has the capability to attain enlightenment and Buddhahood, complete and total Buddhahood. And some people just take longer, or they're at a different part on the path, or they don't know they have this Buddha nature, and that explains why they're not Buddhas right now. But if we understand our own Buddha nature and that of everybody else's, then our behavior is necessarily changed. It's necessarily changed to be more compassionate, kind, respectful, deferent, venerative, etc. And I can see that working on people around me. People are nice at the temple. People take those messages and they go around and they live differently because of them. And I do so too myself. And I think that that's what Buddhism has to offer there. It shows you that this thing that we're calling mind, it has the potential for great bad. It has the potential to be harmful to yourself and to others around you. But it also has the potential to be good too, of course. But what we should understand about it that is crucial is that it is precious. Good or bad, it is precious. And so is that of everyone else. So is that of every sentient being. Not just people, but animals also. Which is why we don't eat or kill or harm animals in Shingon Buddhism. It also applies to bugs, it applies to spirits, it applies to gods, it applies to Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, it applies to everyone. And so as a result of that, I think that the message that is core, that is key, is that we're all dependent on each other. Everything in the world is dependent on everything else and has the same nature with it. And that is why we are good to it. We're good to everything. Because whenever I'm doing something good to somebody else, I'm also doing something good to myself. And whenever they do something good, they're doing something good for me. And that's sort of the message. That's sort of why all of these ethical judgments, like don't kill, don't steal, don't harm, don't misuse sexual relationships, don't do this, don't do that. That's why all of that makes sense. That's why all that works, is because it's not just you.
Sure.
You don't exist
Yeah,
in a
thanks for
vacuum.
that. It sounds like you were at the end kind of getting into Buddhist ethics, which, is a huge part and parcel of Buddhism. There's this misconception that we talk about, a lot, and we'll get into that, when we review Evan Thompson's book. But there's a misconception that Buddhism is a philosophy, but it's not a religion. But that's simply not true. Buddhism has many ethical imperatives for lay people. For monks, you were telling me some ones I didn't know the other day, and it has a lot to do with how to live a good life, and Buddhism is very interested in that in terms of what you should do, how you should think, what kinds of mental states you should ostensibly try to achieve. And it's a huge part of the enterprise. And it's interesting because I think I was asking essentially more about the structure of the mind, but again it goes back to what I was kind of saying earlier with political issues. There is no talking about the structure of the mind, the nature of the mind, without also talking about, okay, so what do we do? What do we do about it in light of, the structure of this thing that we're calling mind? I didn't ask that, as expecting it to be an answer about ethics, but it's cool because, you really can't answer it without also answering what is to be done about this. I think you did a really good job of highlighting both. Yeah, it's cool, and I'm sure we'll have lots of opportunity as you come back to discuss more about that. And thank you for the historical background about Kukai and Shingon. It's been a while since I've read, I think it was Hakeda's book on Kukai. So I'm getting a lot of, re-education on all this stuff. So I appreciate that. Yeah. Yeah, so I think I'd like to
Wonderful. Yeah,
close
of
out
course.
here soon with just this last question of, again, there's theory and then there's praxis. Or practice. We've talked a lot about, kind of what Buddhism has to say about the structure of the mind and maybe what it has to offer in terms of, understanding what the mind is. But I would also like to give people, obviously there's a lot more to say about that, but I'd also like to give people, references, resources that they might be able to use if they're interested in exploring the nature of their own minds through this Buddhist lens. So, yeah, to this end, what Buddhist practices and or resources could you point to that you find particularly interesting, helpful, that people can use to explore the nature of their own minds and their own lives?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that the sort of real aspect is very important, like you say, and I think that in order to sort of understand a Buddhist concept of mind and to see if that fits and works for you on a personal level, one particularly good book is one that you already mentioned, the translation of the works of Kukai into English by a Japanese scholar named Yoshito Hakeda. This was authored, I think, in the 70s or so, and it's just an English translation and a short biography of Kukai and everything he got up to. That's a good introduction specifically into Shingon consciousness, Shingon Buddhism, Shingon theory and practice, if that's what you think is for you. But to get at this question of just general Buddhist psychology, Buddhist mind ideas, you could look to a number of different sutras. So, one of my favorite sutras for at least this question of Buddha nature, which I think is sort of foundational to the Mahayana Buddhist concept of mind in a structural sense, is the Tathagata Garbha Sutra. That is a Sanskrit word that very hard to say, very complicated, very long, but it means the Buddha Nature Sutra. So if you look up the Buddha Nature Sutra, you should be able to find that. That'll explain how Buddha nature fits into a structural concept of the mind. It gives you an answer to the question of, if I have Buddha nature, where is it? Point to it. Show me where it is on my body, or something like that. Show me where it is. And how does that work? Can you see it? Can you touch it? Can you hold it? Etc. With regards to just in general, like how Buddhist thinkers conceive of consciousness and the mind, there, of course, is that five aggregates philosophy that I mentioned before, but there's also this interesting thing which is foundational to this kind of dependent origination doctrine I was talking about before. And it's this series of 12 nidanas, or these 12 points of dependent origination. It sort of describes how the structure of our consciousness is built in the world and maintained in the world that we live in. And unfortunately, the default state is ignorance. So the very first thing is ignorance. The very first, you could say, the very first cornerstone of mind in the Buddhist conception is ignorance. And that ignorance is with regards to the fact that we may think that our mind is self. We may think that our body is self. We may think that inside of us somewhere there is such a thing as a soul. And so that's the ignorant part, is that Buddhism says, no, there is no self in that sense. There's no capital S self. There is no soul. And that cornerstone is ignorance, and that ignorance leads to birth and death and to suffering and to just continued existence in the world around us. And so that's a very good doctrine to look to and to read sutras about for understanding the relationship between that ignorance and the perpetuation of this reality that we live in. In Buddhism, it's called samsara, right? The realm of being born and living and suffering and dying, and then being born again and living and suffering and dying, and then being born again, living and suffering and dying, all this stuff. So that's very important and very transformative as well. In terms of this affirmational look at the Bodhisattva path and saving all sentient beings, one of my favorite sutras is the Vimalakirti Sutra. It's the sutra given by this guy Vimalakirti, who explains the Bodhisattva path that I've just mentioned to you as being saving all sentient beings and raising them to enlightenment. He explains that to the Buddha's disciples, and he explains it so well, and he's so good at it, and he knows so much about it, that the disciples were actually afraid to go see him whenever the Buddha asked them to, so that's always fun. You can read about why they were so scared about that. And in particular, also, I really like Zen Buddhism, and I know that you do too, Christian, and so I will always, always, always say, go read the Shobo Genzo by Dogen. The Shobo Genzo translates in English to the Treasury of the True Dharma Eye, and it's just a collection of these treatises which talk about mind, talk about reincarnation, talk about emptiness, but they have a very unique and interesting spin on it. They have a unique and interesting Zen sort of look at it. And I really enjoyed that. I really loved reading that when I read that for the first time. So definitely go look at that as well. And finally, the last thing I would say to go read is the... I was going to say the Lotus Sutra, but I don't think I want to say that this time because it doesn't have a lot about mind in particular. Maybe instead, I'll actually say, go read the Tao Te Ching, and I won't elaborate on that. Yeah, so we didn't lose too much. I'll say that I really have always liked the Shobo Genzo because it has a very interesting and unique perspective on these doctrines of impermanence and emptiness that I've talked about. It's a very interesting and Zen look at those things. The Shobo Genzo translates to the Shobo Genzo translates to the Treasury of the True Dharma Eye, and it's a series of fascicles that all concern these doctrines written by a famous Zen master named Dogen, who founded Soto Zen in Japan in the 1200s. And the last thing that I will recommend will be the Tao Te Ching, and I won't really elaborate on why, other than to say that the Tao Te Ching will shape how you look at Buddhist texts in a very, very important way, and you might not even know it. It might be beneath the surface. But if you read the Tao Te Ching and you come to your own conclusions about it, then when you go read Buddhist texts, you'll be miles ahead of somebody who hasn't read the Tao Te Ching. And that's not me arguing, of course, that, the Tao Te Ching has some sort of very direct, very serious influence on any specific Buddhist text, but it is to say that the Tao Te Ching was a character in the history of Buddhism in China, and therefore will be important to know as context whenever you read something in
Sure.
in the
Thanks
Buddhist
for all that, Nick.
canon.
I really appreciate that again. Offering kind of suggestions about things that people can read in terms of the theory. I think as if people read those texts, that there's a lot to offer in terms of practice as well, in terms of meditation, and what Kukai thinks of that, what Dogen thinks of that, how they kind of prescribe people can or should practice meditation. And yeah, I think that kind of brings us nicely to the end. Um, I will say that you were able to reintroduce me to a lot of terms that I've forgotten. I felt like fish out of water a little bit. And to that end, I will recommend that people listen to your podcast if they, well, for a lot of terms that they might not have recognized, a lot of terms that I've forgotten. If you are interested to learn more about these Buddhist concepts, these Buddhist ideas, and stories that Nick was talking about, please check out his podcast. I'll be doing that myself as well. Um, he's a really great scholar and thinks and reads and writes a lot about this stuff. So Nick is a great resource for looking at all of that. Nick, thank you for coming on the show. Any last words about consciousness, Buddhism, anything that we discussed?
Yeah, no, thank you very much for having me on. I've appreciated this Vijñapti project from minute one when you first told me that it was happening. And I've been very happy to be involved and to hear about it and to be involved with it. I think that it's going to be a wonderful resource and a wonderful multimedia project for people to look to get many different positive perspectives on the nature of mind and consciousness and what to do about that thereof. Any last words for Buddhism? I would just have to say that the structure and the meaning and the action of mind is precious, and treat your own as that way and also treat everybody else's as that way. It's really just a question of compassion. You know, that's what it's all come down to for me, really, is, what is the most compassionate thing to do in any moment? That's the kind of the Buddhist standard, right? I don't necessarily do that all the time in my daily life. I'm a human being, and sometimes I have emotions and I get angry and sad and mean and all these other things. But in a Buddhist sense, truly in a Buddhist sense, if you want to live a Buddhist life, if you want to understand yourself and others in a Buddhist way, then in all things all the time, just ask yourself, what is the most compassionate thing for the most people that I could be doing right now? And
Awesome.
whatever your
All
answer
right.
is Buddhist.
Well, thank you, Nick, for coming on again, and I'm looking forward to having you on in the future. So, again, I'll recommend Nick's podcast, Bright on Buddhism, if you're interested in learning anything more about the topics that we discussed today. Nick, thanks so much for coming on and being my first guest, and this was a lot of fun. Yep,
It
definitely.
was. Thank you so much for having me on, and I'll see you next time.